All right, here's more of a conceptual question instead of calculation. So we have this psychology test and a self-image score. Um, we have what the claim is. So these, you can think of these as population values. This would be your mean and your sigma. And the idea is that maybe this is decreased. So we're going to take a sample and see if that jives well with the current existing believed values or if something seems off. So the null hypothesis, null is nothing, and it should always have the equal sign. The null hypothesis, this would be there hasn't been any change, there hasn't been any shift, and in this case, the mean still sits at 90. The alternative, she believes that it has decreased, so because of that directional word, we're going to use a less than sign. So essentially she believes that the mean is less than 90. Again, the parameter here will always be the same and the number will always be the same. The only thing different between the null and alternative will be the symbol that's in the middle. So let's suppose we decide not to reject. So we don't know what the all the data were other than the sample mean itself, and that alone does not give us enough information whether or not to reject. But it says she decides not to reject. Well, if you fail to reject, the only type of error you could be making is a type 2. A type 1 is rejecting when you're not supposed to, or when it's actually you're rejecting the null even though it turns out that it's true. So here we decided not to reject. So that the only possible error would be a type 2, where you fail to reject even though you should have rejected because the null is false. So in any case, whatever you decide, there's always some error. If you reject the null, it's possible you made a type 1 error. If you fail to reject, it's possible you made a type 2 error. Suppose the true mean is 76. Fill in the blanks to describe it. So here it turns out that the hypothesis was true. Her alternative was true, that the null hypothesis is false and that this is the reality. That's what this is telling us. A type 2 error would be failing to reject that the hypothesis that the mean, so type 2, you're failing to reject the null even though the null is false. So a type 2 error would be failing to reject the hypothesis that the null is equal to 90, when in fact it's actually less than 90. We should have rejected, but failed to reject. It's not the researcher's fault. Most of the time, it's just the sample data. It's through randomness is why this happens. But type 2 error is always failing to reject the hypothesis, that the null hypothesis, basically, when in reality the mean is less than 90. So what would a type 1 error be? A type 1 error would be rejecting the null, so rejecting this thing, when in fact the null is true, when in fact mean equals 90. That would be a type 1 error.